Now, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In this Black History Month special, on this 100th anniversary of the birth of Rosa Parks, we continue our conversation with Jeanne Theoharis, author of the new book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. I asked her what happened after Rosa Parks was arrested and convicted, how she dealt with losing her job.
So about a month in, she's working at, again, this department store downtown Montgomery Fair. And about a month in, they let her go. And then simultaneously, her husband is a barber at the Air Force Base. And they basically say, they pass this rule, they say, there can be no talk of the boycott or of that woman in the barbershop. And for a political proud man like Raymond Parks, that's untenable. So we're basically a month in, and both of them have lost their jobs.
And this is a month into the bus boycott.
Yes. So we have another year of the bus boycott. So for the majority of the bus boycott, they do not have steady work. She spends most of that year traveling the country fundraising for the Montgomery Improvement Association and the NAACP, basically turning this local struggle into a national movement, and also raising money. Part of what sustains the boycott is this amazingly organized carpool. But that carpool requires money, and so they send some of the ministers out, but they also send Rosa Parks out. And so here she's doing all of this fundraising for the movement at this time when her own family is in sort of a serious economic trouble.
What do you mean carpool? Explain what happened in that year that African Americans did not use the bus system of Montgomery, Alabama.
So part of how they are able to do this for, again, almost 13 months is they develop this carpool system where you pay the fare, the bus fare, so it's the 10 cents bus fare, and they set up all of these pickup stations, like 40-odd pickup stations across the city, and you go there and then you can get a ride sort of across town to, if you need to work, if you need to go to the doctor, if you need to do shopping. So it's this amazingly elaborate system to sort of independent transportation system. Churches fundraise and buy church vehicles to help with this. There's this amazing cross-class sort of solidarity where sort of middle and upper-class Black people loan their cars or let their cars be driven in the carpool.
And the buses would still go their routes empty?
Yes. And so the bus fare goes up. They start to cut routes, right? Because the majority of passengers on the bus in Montgomery are Black people. So when Black people stop riding the bus in Montgomery, it takes a huge economic toll. There's a whole kind of white segregationist movement to sort of like, we have to ride the bus, we have to stand up for the bus, you need to give your money to the bus on the other side. But yeah, so this carpool is part of how they sustain this movement, right? It's a very organized movement. But they realize that they're going to need to do fundraising outside of Montgomery, and Rosa Parks is part of that effort. So I think the other thing, when we talk about her role in the Montgomery bus boycott, we often forget even the role she plays in sustaining the boycott itself. But it's at a time when, they're getting constant death threats and hate calls, so much so that her mother often will just talk on the phone all afternoon, in part just to keep the line busy, because both her mother and her husband find the calls very upsetting. She's away a lot, so she says that it's harder on them than on her. Even when the boycott ends, they still have trouble finding work. And so they actually leave Montgomery for Detroit 8 months after the boycott ends, in part because they can't find work. They're still getting death threats. There had been some pressure and hope that the Montgomery Improvement Association would hire her. That does not happen.
Why?
I mean, Edie Nixon and her sort of are a little bit seen as sort of outsiders. They are working class. They are in many ways more political. They have this longer political history. They are trying to start this Alabama voter registration project, much, sort of foreshadowing what the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party project will look like, and they're trying to get this money for this. They are unable to get it. She would have run it full time.
Well, tell me what happened at the end of 1956. How did the bus boycott end?
The bus boycott actually ends because the Supreme Court rules that the buses have to be desegregated. Sort of shortly after.
For the whole country?
for Montgomery. So she's arrested in December. And one of the things that they had learned, because again, these are seasoned activists, and there had been cases before that, is they got worried that it was going to get held up in state court, her case. And so in February 1956, Fred Gray, who's the black lawyer we were talking about, files a new case right into federal court using other plaintiffs other than Rosa Parks. Right, so it's a case that the title of the case becomes Browder v. Gale. Browder's Aurelia Browder. She is one woman. Claudette Colvin, Mary Louise Smith, other people who had been arrested and had trouble on the bus. Rosa Parks is not actually part of that case, and I think that's for a couple of different reasons. They don't want to risk it getting thrown out because she has a separate case in state court, but also I think they are worried by the NAACP, in the wake of Brown, is increasingly getting red-baited. You know, by June of 1956, it will be outlawed in the state of Alabama.
How is it outlawed? The NAACP, June 1956.
I mean, they basically many, particularly southern states, come after the NAACP. They say it is a foreign organization. They ask that they turn their records over. The NAACP refuses to turn their membership records over because obviously that is putting all of their members in harm's way.
Thurgood Marshall, the later would-be Supreme Court Justice, came out of the NAACP.
Right, and so it's this, I mean, it is, if we're thinking about sort of Septima Clark at Highlander, she loses her job in South Carolina in part because she refuses to give up her membership. And you can't be a teacher, you can't be a civil servant in South Carolina and be a member of the NAACP. So she is running those workshops at Highlander when Rosa Parks meets her in 1955, in part because she has had to give up her job because of her connection to the NAACP. So I think the other reason why I think they ultimately don't have Parks on this case is the fear of her history with the NAACP and the kind of red baiting that's going on. And so it makes it, so again, for these two different reasons, both procedural and the kind of larger climate. So that case then makes its way through the federal courts up to the Supreme Court. And so it is actually that court case and the Supreme Court ruling that Montgomery's buses will be desegregated. And so on December 20th, we have those very famous pictures, I think, that all of us have seen, right, of Martin Luther King in the front of the bus, and then that very iconic picture of Rosa Parks. Not one that is not my personal favorite, right? She's in profile, she's looking out the window. There is a white man sitting behind her. It's a staged photo. That white man is actually a reporter. It is staged. Look magazine. Most of the media, interestingly, doesn't care about her. They are with Martin Luther King that day. It's this, again, Look magazine comes and finds her at her house and takes that picture, and then now that picture is iconic. Obviously, we saw President Obama sort of tweet a picture, like he goes to, and there's a picture taken of President Obama in the classic Rosa Parks bus, in the Rosa Parks pose that we saw him tweet in December on the anniversary of the bus boycott. So,
and yet it's staged. But certainly the bus boycott wasn't.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I'm looking at a photograph right now in your book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks, of Rosa Parks and Eleanor Roosevelt just before a civil rights rally here in New York at Madison Square Garden.
Absolutely. It's so Rosa Parks meets Eleanor Roosevelt in New York in 1956. As I was saying, she's doing all this traveling and raising money in the profile of the movement. And Eleanor Roosevelt and Miles Horton, again, who is the head of Highlander, she meets Eleanor Roosevelt through Miles Horton, and Eleanor Roosevelt says to Miles Horton, well, you told her she was going to get red-baited, right? And so there's this really interesting conversation where Eleanor Roosevelt is very aware of kind of what's going to happen to somebody who stands out for civil rights in 1955. And then the picture in the book is there's this major civil rights rally here, a fundraiser organized by Ella Baker, actually, and in Friendship, that's held at Madison Square Garden. And Parks is out there. The picture also includes Autherine Lucy. She is the woman who desegregates the University of Alabama very briefly before she is kicked out for for the riot that then ensues when she does desegregate the University of Alabama. So it's a beautiful picture of the three of them right before that big demonstration here and a big rally here in New York.
How did Rosa Parks fit into the whole Black Power movement?
Well, so she moves to Detroit in 1957, and her activism continues. And it continues in terms of sort of working against and challenging the racism of sort of this new hometown and the sort of Jim Crow North, and so around housing, around jobs, around police brutality. And she is extremely active, and many of the issues that she's long been committed to by the mid to late 60s are now intersecting with this growing Black Power movement. And so these are not new issues for her, and she is sort of delighted by sort of these new young voices in the struggle. And so she goes to, attends many, helps out with all sorts of mobilizations around political prisoners, right? The Wilmington 10, Joanne Little, Angela Davis.
The Wilmington 10 who were just exonerated, pardoned by the governor of North Carolina.
So Rosa Parks is this steadfast, she's always been very committed to criminal justice, and by the 60s this intersects with sort of these movements to defend sort of both political prisoners and other unjustly targeted Black people. She's been a long-standing proponent of changing the curriculum, of having more Black history in the curriculum. She's, again, as we talked about, a long-standing opponent of the war in Vietnam. She's the need for Black people in political office and independent Black political power. These are all issues that she's been working on for decades, and so they sort of are at the heart of the Black Power movement. And so she then becomes part of and takes part in sort of various Black Power mobilizations. She attends the Gary Convention.
The Gary Convention being?
The National Black Convention in Gary, Indiana in 1972 to kind of build an independent Black political sort of movement to, in many ways, sort of make the kind of national parties sort of have to sort of really take Black political power seriously. She attends, in 1968, one of the first big Black Power conferences in Philadelphia. Nathan here tells this funny story. She would go, she would sit, she would learn. She would often do her sewing. She takes part in the People's Tribunal in Detroit. After the 1967 Detroit riot, part of what happens is there's all of this police, what Conyers calls a police riot actually happens, right? There's all of this police aggression, police violence. One of the most egregious is 3 young men are killed during the riot by police. The police claim a gun battle, except there are no guns found on the young men. But the police are not charged. The Detroit media refuses to kind of print a story, kind of a fuller investigation. And so they hold this People's Tribunal in Reverend Clegg's church and basically sort of do this public airing of it. And they call witnesses, and it's this sort of moment of kind of putting kind of Detroit police on trial in the absence of getting a real trial. She serves on the jury for that. So she maintains her activism, right? And she shows up long after, I think in the sort of fable, right, we have the Civil Rights Movement, we have a Civil Rights Act, we have a Voting Rights Act, and then, like, all's good, right? And I think when we follow the actual Rosa Parks, we see that the movement and its issues continue because many things have not been resolved, and so she continues on, right? And so there's another picture in the book of her picketing outside the South African embassy in the 80s, right? She's sort of a long-time opponent of apartheid and of kind of U.S. complicity in the sort of South African apartheid. And so here we have her in her 70s picketing outside the South African embassy against apartheid.
Historian Jeanne Theoharis, author of the new book, The Rebellious Life of Mrs. Rosa Parks. The book is just out. 100 years ago today, civil rights pioneer Rosa Parks was born. It was February 4th, 1913. On December 1st, 1955, at the age of 42, she refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man in Montgomery, Alabama. She was arrested and convicted of violating the state's segregation laws. Her act of resistance led to a 13-month boycott of the Montgomery bus system that led ultimately to a Supreme Court decision desegregating that system. She helped spark the civil rights movement and launched Dr. Martin Luther King. Today, the U.S. Postal Service is releasing a commemorative Rosa Parks Forever stamp. You can go to our website website to read a section of the book and to read my column, Rosa Parks, Now and Forever. If you'd like a copy of today's show, go to our website at Democracy. Thanks so much for watching this report from Democracy Now!, your daily independent global news hour. We don't accept advertising or corporate funding, but rather rely on donations from viewers like you. Please make your contribution by visiting democracynow.org. We need your support today to keep bringing you this hard-hitting, in-depth reporting.